Take all your dollars, bury them in your garden. Watch the food come up, just trying to catch the sky. Gather up your harvest, carry it off to market. We'll all rejoice in the fruits of life. Ain't that nice?
Hey happy people, it's Gabby and welcome back to another edition of the Happi Home Workshop Web-series. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to feel more at home in our worldview. And we have the honor of being joined by Rako Fabionar. Rako is the founder and executive director of the Innovative Learning and Living Institute, which co-stewards Landwell, a 22-acre wayfinding place and hub for regenerative living, cultural renewal, and community resilience. For nearly 3 decades, Rako has designed transformative learning experiences that integrate scientific insight, social innovation, and sacred practice into workshops, programs, and cultural initiatives in the US and abroad. Lastly, he is a dear friend, mentor, and partner of Happi. Without further ado, Rako.
Hello, my name is Rako. Welcome to my home. I got really interested, in high school, and then definitely in my undergraduate years when I went to school around how do we grow, how do we develop, how do we evolve, and some of that just I was just very, very curious about how do we come into, adulthood, how do we, later on I would say, how do we grow in our ability to care about more people and more places? And some of it came from being at a high school, an inner city school that was predominantly low income, a lot of gangs, a lot of violence, and we were locked in like prisoners. And I got very curious around, this is a really big kind of a dog-eat-dog worldview here, in a what we might call an opportunistic worldview. It's like if I can grab something and take something because I don't have enough, I'm going to do it because I can, and because I don't have enough. And I got very curious of why that existed. That wasn't my experience, growing up. My experience, because I lived in what we might call a kinship worldview, where there was a lot of sharing amongst family and extended family, and so much that we tended not to care for ourselves. We tended to care for the family more. The idea that we can just take and would take what we want was a bit jarring to me, and yet those folks who were doing that, I knew they were coming from really violent places, or they were being hunted by police, or didn't have enough food to eat, or all the reasons we know that why people would grab something, because there's a lack of stability and lack of food. And so I got really, really curious about that in high school. Why do these different worldviews exist? And then when I did have the opportunity to go to school, I got very interested in, in how do people develop? How do they grow in their identity? That was a big thing when I was in school. It's like, how do our identities grow? How do we mature? Not necessarily in the ways that we talk about, grow up to be a functioning adult, although, that was part of it. It's like, how do we really, really grow in the heart? How do we really, really grow in terms of, how do I, care about my friends, or care about a potential partner or girlfriend? How do I learn to care about more people and more places? And about that time, I was exploring different religious and spiritual traditions that had different perspectives and instructions on how we wake up. How do we, become enlightened, or how do we evolve? And so that was kind of a lot of the foundation, which really what came down to how do I belong and care about those who I belong with. What's the type of learning that feels not just heady and intellectually stimulating, but learning that actually can help me feel better, less anxious, less depressed, more clear about who I am in the world. So I mean, there's different philosophies, schools of study, models and theories around what these are. But I usually talk about worldviews as ecosystems, where many of them can exist at the same time. If we're using the metaphor of a lens, I think it almost can be a kaleidoscope, where you can see one color and you can see another color, and then you can mix them, you can see all colors at once. certain situations or conditions of our lives in our environments will bring forth certain worldviews or ways of seeing things or perceiving things. If I'm in a particularly intense or traumatic situation, my worldview is really around survival, and it's very instinctive, right? And so it's an instinctive worldview, and the real core priority is survival. I named another one, which is really kinship, and so if we're in a situation or conditions where, we want to feel safe and we want to still feel connected and take care of each other in reciprocal ways. This is where we see, kind of a kinship worldview where the priority is safety and connection, and usually connected to things that we understand family to be, or broader kin. Who are my people? There's another one. There's another worldview that if life feels really chaotic, or the conditions are really violent and rough and impoverished, we see a worldview where it's really about power and what I can take, and we might call it a warrior view, or an opportunistic worldview, where it's about the priority is power and getting, right, and doing so unapologetically, And then there's a worldview where where there's like a higher purpose, or a higher cause, or singular purpose, where people believe in a particular doctrine or book or philosophy, almost like rigidly so. And that's a more kind of a traditional worldview that's more black and white, right? And for some people that shows up as me believing in, a holy book, like the holy book is right and everything else is wrong, right? Or that might be a particular political philosophy, or that might be a national identity. You're either with us or against us as an American, right? It's a very either or thing. And this is kind of a more traditional worldview where people are sacrificing their individual sense for some higher purpose or order. One that most of us are familiar with is a modern worldview, and this is where we see there's, how do we, the priority is really about, achievement and making things better, and how do we experiment with the best ways to be successful. And then we also have a more kind of egalitarian worldview that is often very critical of the modern worldview, because if you're just striving for your own individual success and playing the game to win, then what about those who might not have had the opportunities to start off on equal ground, and so there's a care for those who do not have, and the feeling in an egalitarian worldview where everybody should have an equal voice, and everybody should have enough access to resources, and everybody should speak authentically, and how they feel, and that we should care about each other on this planet. And then there's others, but those six are kind of ones that are really predominant. And I think what we begin to recognize is that depending on the situation or the context or the conditions, that these different worldviews, if we were looking at them as a garden or a forest, they all exist within us. I might be hanging out at Thanksgiving with my family, and my kinship worldview will be really, really, really like bright and activated because it feels safe and most of the time, and warm. Or I might be in a community of folks who are coming from diverse backgrounds and are very concerned about democracy, and my egalitarian worldview will brighten. It doesn't mean my kinship worldview isn't there, but I'm in the context and conditions where this is really, really happening. Or I might be playing a sport, an individual sport where I'm really trying to dominate the game physically. And so my opportunistic worldview about me grabbing the rebound and being more like, this is mine, and that's more of kind of an acceptable context for this, for the type of power grab, literally. So it really depends on the context, but the idea is that some version of these exists within us, like a garden, like an ecosystem, and how do we begin to once recognize that, and then begin to the best that we can, express them in ways that are as healthy as possible, because there's obviously unhealthy things and healthy and unhealthy expressions to these different worldviews. And once we begin to recognize that within ourselves, we begin to recognize that others are also walking around with an ecosystem of worldviews, and then we can perhaps have ways to be able to connect and create more belonging. How might I begin to bridge or create belonging with people who I might not connect with because I just see them as, as something that doesn't matter? Tension or emotion, such as, irritation. Let's say irritation, before it becomes full anger. It's just like kind of irritated about something that somebody said, or even if it's anger. But let's just start with irritation. It's like, if there's a way, if we could just begin to practice, like when irritation comes up for us, to be kind of curious, like, why am I irritated? What is it that the other person said that is irritating me? Because it's usually connected to a particular worldview or perspective that they're holding that I don't hold, or it's triggering or activating something in me that I don't like. And so I think the first kind of micro practice is if I feel irritation when I'm in conversation with somebody or texting somebody, to be curious about it first. Like, why am I irritated, right? And then the next one might be, if we're able to do that, just to be kind of curious, and maybe just the second thing is, let me just kind of breathe for a second. Let me just breathe. To wherever I might notice that irritation, just exhale, just kind of collecting ourselves, if I can do that, maybe once or 3 times. And so that's number 2. And then the third one might be like, and this one is hard can be hard for me or hard for others, but it's like, what's something that they said, the thing that I'm irritated by, is there something in what they said that might be partially true? Is there something in there that's a thread that I can connect to, that I can build rapport or build rapport is not maybe the right word, but I can hope to connect and create a sense of mutuality and belonging if I feel safe, if I feel I have energy to do so, So curiosity, breathing, taking a breath, and then what's the truth or partial truth that's connected to a particular worldview or what they're saying that I might be able to bridge or connect to in a genuine way. Again, those bridging is not always, it's not always time to bridge. We don't always have the energy or the feeling safe to bridge, and so it takes some discernment and it takes support. But I think the opportunity to do that is actually much greater than we think it is, and we have to, to the degree we can, be open to those opportunities, or else, we suffer a lot. This is one way, and one conceptual way, especially when we learn to really, really work with it in community and through our bodies, where it's a cheat code for feeling better and feeling more connected and being able to be more creative in the world. Learning to do this in community, whether online or in person, or both, is really important, because that's where it starts. We have to learn to do things in community, not only because it's funner to do and we get to share food, but it's the learning is deepened, and then we feel less alone, and then we can grow. I mean, if there's a gift of our modern worldview, it's really like, how do we become self-determined and sovereign, and care about the self, but if there's a shadow to it, it's the idea that we're separate from others and separate from place, right? And so who we are and who we develop into is always developed in relationship to others in place, always. We don't exist outside of place and other people. One of the challenges of our modern worldview is sometimes we're not aware that we're in it. you know, and so if we're feeling alienated or feeling, you know, pain or dissonance or anxiety, we think it's just, that's just me in my craziness or my, you know, and so I'd say, you know, really find out those people and places that support us or can support us. Seek that out, you know, and that will help, because sometimes we try to, you know, numb it or dissociate from it. But you know, we all need other people and places that support us in our development, in our healing, in our growth. And that's my prayer, is that we continue to learn to care about ourselves, develop ourselves to be certain, but how do we continue to grow to care about and have the capacity to care about more people, more places.
Thanks for joining us for this Happi Home Workshop. I hope it's got you feeling inspired to take on different lenses so that you're better able to build bridges and feel belonging with the people in your life. If you want to deepen your learning, Rako's curated a list of resources below this video. And as always, thank you for your valuable attention, and I hope you have a happy day.
We'll all rejoice in the fruits of life. Ain't that nice? Hard work, long days, dirt hands make for clean ways. You won't waste another day in your garden